it's time now for Korea Book Club, our weekly dive into the world of Korean literature and books through works in Korean and in English translations. This week we have with us a cultural essayist, Colin Marshall, who is also the host of his own podcast, Colin의 한국, and the author of the essay collection, 한국 요약 금지. He's with us now in the studio. Colin, hello, it's great to see you again.
Glad to be back in. Thanks, Dong-ho.
Okay, so I understand that you have brought in a short story collection for us today, a debut short story collection, no less. It was published this year in Korean, so no English translation yet. But the book and the writer have been making some waves, I believe. Indeed. It has a rather interesting-sounding title as well, with its unconventional mix of languages, right?
The title is 사람의 Internationale, and it belongs to the debut short story collection, as you say, by a writer named Kim Ki-tae. And I was listening to a podcast discussion of this book after I read it, and the host talked about how they were almost put off at first by that combination of what they assumed were Korean and English words in the title, or Korean and one English word. You know, how can two people have an international, which everyone knows isn't a noun but an adjective? You know, you learned that in school. As it turns out, and as the reader only finds out most of the way through the title story, Internationale refers to L'Internationale, the anthem of worldwide socialist movements since the late 19th century, first conceived in France.
I see. So, yes, the Korean title, 두 사람의 Internationale, is, when translated, it's not two people's international, as right. You suggested, but wouldn't make much sense, as you said, but it's two people's L'Internationale.
Yeah, Internationale for two, I'm not sure how I would do it. But
right, referring to the song. Okay,
indeed.
So can you tell us more about it then?
Well, I should back up a little bit about this title because there's one thing to emphasize. The song, the reason that the title is Du saram의 Internationale is, if you can recall the song, I'm not sure if you've heard it before, but we all hear it in history class at some point, I think. The song's first line, Debout les damnés de la terre, or Arise, Wretched of the Earth, becomes a version of the very common Korean expression, himnera, for the two main characters of that story who send it back and forth to each other in the form of internet memes and videos. These are two paradigmatic Kim Ki-tae figures. Both are young. Neither occupy a particularly exalted place in Korean society. One of the characters, Kwon Jinju, stocks shelves at a market while repeatedly failing to pass the civil service exam. And the other, Kim Nikolai, the son of Russian-born ethnic Korean parents, does various kinds of manual labor while repeatedly being thwarted himself in his goal of attaining Korean citizenship. But the two of them do have each other, as they eventually come to realize, in a story that delineates their entire relationship, beginning in their school days and ending with them moving together into a modest apartment and making the acknowledgement, 우리는 친한 사이야. We're close. That's the title story, and for many reviewers, the standout story of this book.
Okay, so they're friends, you're saying that they're not a couple, a romantic couple as such.
But then it goes that direction, but then it's not... There's a bit of ambiguity there, but also you sort of feel what's happening between them.
Okay, I see.
And so, you know, it is both ambiguous and not ambiguous at the same time. That says a lot about his writing style, I think his storytelling style.
So it's an exploration about relationships then.
Indeed.
This seems somewhat far from perhaps the K-drama romances that many of our listeners might be familiar with nowadays, and that have saturated popular culture, of course.
It's true. It's not the kind of story whose TV adaptation would be sponsored by luxury brands, for instance. But Kim Ki-tae's writing does evidence an interest in popular culture, with a strong emphasis on popular. And in the opening story, for instance, he invents a K-pop girl group called 세상 모든 바다, or 세모바, who get bigger than Blackpink, bigger than BTS, bigger around the world than practically any band has ever been. And the narrative voice he uses is that of a fan, but one who's both Korean and not. Haku, his name is Haku, is a Zainichi, or a Japanese-born ethnic Korean, who despite having come to Korea, learned the Korean language, is still regarded here as a foreigner the moment he opens his mouth. In another story, Kim Ki-tae tells of the sudden rise to fame of a singer-songwriter named Rona, as well as all the transformations her public profile undergoes over the subsequent decade or decade and a half, and he conveys all of it through a kind of Greek chorus of anonymous voices, which I don't think it's too much of a spoiler to say are later revealed to be those of the non-celebrities, various figures, professional and otherwise, who made Rona's fame possible in one way or another. So even when he deals with large-scale cultural, intellectual, or economic phenomena, Kim Ki-tae examines them through characters living on the margins, not at the center.
I see. Okay, so you've already whisked us through three of the stories in this collection. I know you wanted to get through as many as possible today to demonstrate the array of stories that are in this collection. But judging from the first three, it seems like Kim likes to write about protagonists who don't quite fit into Korean society.
You could say that about some of the 9 stories in 사람의 Internationale, although in one of them he creates a protagonist who fits all too well into Korean society, you could say, embodying a kind of respectable mediocrity, and he distinguishes himself sufficiently in school, then goes on programmatically to acquire a suitable job, suitable car, suitable wife, all the while coming off as a man without qualities, even to himself. It's not so much that he's presented as miserable with his middle-class lot in life as that he doesn't quite understand why exactly he's passing the milestones he's passing. And Kim Ki-tae allows him a happy ending, looking toward the future of the family he's just started, but the doubts he'd entertained about his path linger in the mind of the reader. Or they linger in my mind anyway, resonant as they do with the times I've heard Koreans wonder aloud if they're living the right way, am I living correctly, that sort of thing.
Okay, so he goes completely the other way in this story then, asking a question that many Koreans will have asked themselves, especially I think young Koreans nowadays, and a question that has become a recurring subject for Korean books and even films in recent years as well. It is interesting to think about that in years gone by, that Korean books seem to once deal with perhaps the basic questions of how to survive, but they now tend towards questions of how to live in a more fulfilling, enjoyable, or philosophically consistent manner.
And in a way true to one's own ideals or desires. To live nadapke, or like myself, and as the phrase goes. The problem for many is working out what their own ideals or desires are, such as the concern of another Kim Ki-tae character, Meng-hee, a 37-year-old woman employed at a minor company with an almost non-existent social life and no accomplishments to her name but a blog she started in college and abandoned. In desperation, she emails her favorite reality show and puts herself forth as a participant. And that show, Solo Nongjang, reads as a kind of parody of the themed matchmaking shows that have long been popular on Korean television. During the shoot, she and others have to live on a farm, calling each other by vegetable nicknames, performing agricultural-related challenges, and in theory, eventually pairing off. Meng-hee does well enough on the show, but the trouble is she grows infatuated not with any of her fellow participants, but the cameraman assigned to interview her. So as interesting as the description of the production itself, which may remind listeners of Tangbishil, Lee Mi-ye's reality TV novella we discussed here a few weeks ago, it's how Kim Ki-tae conveys the reaction of the viewers when Meng-hee's season of Solo Nongjang actually airs, and her reaction to that reaction. Once again, he demonstrates a sharp eye for not just the workings of Korean popular culture, but how everyday people engage with it, whether as producers or consumers.
Yes, these dating shows are very common and popular now in Korea especially, so Kim is tapping into that popularity, it seems then, understanding the zeitgeist as well and conveying his message through that. I mean, it certainly sounds like a real enough show for those who've been watching these sorts of shows. I would believe it.
I mean, when I was reading this book, I was sitting in a mall and I stood up and there was a pop-up store selling goods from one of these shows right across from me. I didn't even realize that. Oh my God. I won't say the name, but it's a show everyone knows.
Sure, it shows how ubiquitous these shows have become in Korea. Yeah. So it really is quite the array of stories and characters then, from the more everyday to less common characters, perhaps seldom encountered in Korean popular culture as well in some of these stories. I
found myself thinking that more and more the deeper I got into this book, whose later stories revolve around figures like a high school female weightlifter growing up in a dreary Gangwon-do casino town, and a man afflicted by what we'd probably describe as obsessive-compulsive disorder. He's compelled to go back home 6, 7, 8 times to make sure he's locked the door, who draws increasingly elaborate connections between his condition and humanity's development of nuclear weapons. But whatever the peculiarities and idiosyncrasies of their lives, these characters nevertheless come off as thoroughly ordinary, in that they're the kind of people you could pass without giving a second look on the street on any given day in a Korean city. But in Kim Ki-tae's telling, this very ordinariness becomes the stuff of literature.
Yeah, so quite, again, an array of stories and characters and settings. I would imagine that it usually takes a certain maturity to pull off this wide-ranging sort of literary observation. But as we said, this is Kim Ki-tae's debut novel, right? Debut book. So he must actually be quite young then.
Yes, just this year he won the Jolmun Chakgasang, or Young Writers Award, which has surely done its part to draw to 사람의 Internationale some of the good deal of attention it's received. But it's not as if he's fresh out of school. According to one profile I read, he's 39 years old. And I, for one, am overjoyed to hear that 39 counts as young. But I also take Du 사람의 Internationale as further evidence of the value for a fiction writer of amassing life experience before publishing anything ambitious. And Kim Ki-tae is mature enough to exhibit traces of the satirist, the heart-warmer, the social critic, or the political radical without having to play any of those roles to the hilt, as a younger writer might have to do to make their name. He writes, rather, as nothing more gimmicky than an observer of Korean life, and he bids fair to become one of the most astute of his generation, or so I think after reading this book.
Right, so it certainly sounds like an exciting debut novel, a new compelling voice that has emerged, and we'll see if there is more to come from him. His name, once again, is Kim Ki-tae, a name to look out for in the future. We've been talking about his debut short story collection, 두 사람의 Internationale, for this week's Korea Book Club. Right, that's it, so we'll leave it there. Colin, thank you for that recommendation, and we'll see you next time. Take care.
Thank you, Jang-won.
And that is where we're going to sign off for today. Do join us again tomorrow to get your daily dose of Korean news analysis. I've been your host, Kwon Jang-won, and thank you, as always, for listening. Goodbye.